Hello and welcome back. It is Monday. I am Mr. Sosotris, and this week I am going to be continuing my Oz spoiler-filled recaps with the fourth Wicked book, Out of Oz. Now I'm going to do this one in two parts because it's quite a long book, and you can see this is part one, and it's kind of a good place to end. So I'm going to do part one this week, and then I'll do part two next. So, a bit of background. Let's see, where are we in the story? So the book before this was A Lion Among Men. The self-proclaimed Emperor of Oz, Throp, who is the brother of Elphaba, and he sort of declared himself emperor. He's also trying to annex Munchkin Land, and so there's this conflict going on. I think in the previous book, the invasion sort of had just started happening, and so this is a few months after that. It's been going on for a bit. The Emerald City wants both the Lake of Restwater, which is sort of a big body of water that's like fresh water, so it can supply the Emerald City. He also wants the farmland in Munchkin Land, because Munchkin Land is kind of the breadbasket of Oz. So, let's see, where else are we here? The Clock of the Time Dragon. There's a group of people who are with that. There's Mr. Boss, who's a dwarf, and Burr, the lion, joins up with them at the end of the last book. Also, Eleonora, or Nor, who's Lear's sister, half-sister. Lear is the son of Elphaba, so he is sort of the son of the Wicked Witch of the West. Nor is his half-sister, and he's been looking for her for a while, but they haven't connected. But she is with the Time Dragon group. This isn't really a spoiler because there's some lineage, like family history stuff at the beginning of this before the story starts. And so since this is going to be spoilers anyways, we learn that the daughter of Lear and Candle, who's the quadling woman that he fell in love with and married, the daughter that they have together is named Rain. And when we first met her, it was at the end of Son of a Witch, where she was sort of left behind for him to find. She had just been born, her skin was green. We didn't know her name at the time, but this book is, it tries to be a little cagey over who Rain's parents are, but it's made very obvious early on. So this isn't like a major spoiler. And you can see the cover features Rain. I love this step back cover. And we get this sort of, of iconic image of Rain with her shell. This is important. She picks this up at one point. This is her little rice otter named Tay, who we'll meet later. This is Iscanary, who's Lear's familiar. He's a talking goose. This is Burr the lion, obviously. We've got a bird here. This is a wren, I believe, who is sort of important, that we meet later. And then we've got poppy fields in the background. So these are all kind of symbolic things that will happen in the book later. But so to get you caught up from where we are. Now, I've said this on the other videos in this series, but I'll repeat it again. This is a spoiler-filled recap. This is designed for people who either don't want to read these books or who have read them in the past and need a refresher. So there's spoilers all over the place. If you don't want to be spoiled, like the spoiler that I just gave earlier, sorry, be sure that you do not watch this video, read the book, and then come back. If you don't mind spoilers, it's fine. They're going to be all over the place with this. So let's get into Out of Oz, Part 1. All right, I have my notes here, so let's do this. Now we start off with a prologue. The prologue is set in our world and features Dorothy Gale, of all people. She is in San Francisco with Uncle Henry and Aunt Em. They're there for a medical procedure for one of them, and I can't remember which one. I think it's Aunt Em. They wouldn't normally be able to afford, traveling so far, but they do. So Dorothy gets stuck in an elevator at one point, and an earthquake hits the city. So the continuity isn't going to make sense if you're really familiar with the original Oz books, but this is just a separate timeline, and we've got Dorothy, who's caught in an earthquake in the prologue. That's all we know so far. All right, moving on. Part 1 is called To Call Winter Upon Water. So we meet a little girl named Rain, and she has normal colored skin. She's just kind of a maid. She's working for Glinda. So that Glinda, yes. And so the civil war between Munchkinland and the Emerald City is in full swing. Glinda is at her estate Mockbeggar Hall in Munchkinland. Now, she's not a Munchkinlander. She's from Gillikin in the north. But she's staying there. She doesn't really feel like she would be safe in the Emerald City either. So this is kind of a safe place where she can be, but she's caught in this civil war. And so we've got General Cherrystone. He was commander before, but he's general now. He's ordered her to evacuate. So he wants to requisition Mockbeggar Hall for the army. She's refusing to leave. And so he's got her kind of under siege and kind of under house arrest. So they control the land around it, but she's refusing to leave. And so her and General Cherrystone have kind of an adversarial relationship where they sort of have polite tease and talk, but he's always trying to find a way to get her out. There's no real legal precedent. Like, he doesn't really have anything legal to back him up to get her out, but he's just kind of waiting for her to sort of eventually give up and leave. So he's trying to make her life as difficult as possible. He wants to arrest Glinda for treason eventually, but she reminds him he has no authority for that, and he's on shaky legal ground. So they're kind of in a stalemate at this point, and she's living under house arrest, basically. She sends most of her staff away, but she does keep a few essential people in the estate, including Rain. So, during a meal where Cherrystone is trying to get information from Glinda and she's deflecting, he sees Rain and he offers to teach her to read. He and Glinda sort of have a wager at this point. She said that she'll learn to cook because, you know, she's a member of the upper crust and she's never cooked anything in her life. And he'll teach Rain to read, and they'll see which of the two is sort of more successful in the end. At one point, they learn that the clock of the time dragon is on its way towards them, and so the dwarf who's with them, whose name is Mr. Boss, he gets in touch with Glinda. The time dragon clock comes and does a show for the soldiers, and it's kind of a strange show. The time dragon clock is magical, and it puts on these little puppet shows, and so it shows the soldiers drowning in a lake. And the soldiers are kind of distracted by this. Cherrystone is sort of enraged by it. He thinks that it's seditious material. But Mr. Boss meets secretly with Glinda, and he removes the Grimoire, the book of magic that has been very important throughout all the other books, and which we learned in the last book belonged to Merlin. He removes the Grimoire from the hiding place in the time dragon clock and gives it to Glinda because he doesn't feel like he can keep it safe any longer. It's his job to keep the book safe, and that's part of what the time dragon clock is. It's a means of sort of hiding and protecting the book. But there's so many soldiers around, he feels like he needs to take the heat off of himself for a bit, and so he's stashing it with her. And even though there's sort of soldiers everywhere and, you know, it's very unsafe, Glinda feels like she can keep it safe kind of under their noses because they won't be expecting it. So she takes the book and hides it. Now, when she's looking at it, she realizes that she's kind of able to read it. She's not able to read it as well as Elphaba did because she's fully from Oz, and only people from our world or who are connected to our world can read the Grimoire. But the Grimoire does have a life of its own. It's kind of like the One Ring from Lord of the Rings. It has a will, and so it opens itself for Glinda and shows her a spell for concealment. And so she is able to kind of muddle through it to the point where she's able to disguise the book as kind of a ragged copy of Gone with the Wind, which of course is like a human book from our world, and so no one there knows it. She doesn't recognize the book at all. She just thinks it's nonsense, but she hides it on the shelf and it's disguised so no one can see it. Meanwhile, Cherrystone is getting a little more bold. He's starting to cause more problems for Glinda's staff. He kills her chef, and he's trying to make things as miserable for her as possible so that she will either relent and give herself over to be taken in, or to try to run away so they can chase after her. So Glinda takes the Grimmery at one point and is trying to find a way to use its magic to destroy Cherrystone's army, but of course it won't listen to her now. It just looks like a normal everyday book. But she sends Rain on a mission, because Rain is small. She's about 7 or 8 at this point, so she's little. And she sends her to spy on Cherrystone's army. Rain reports back and says that it looks like they're building boats for some reason, and they've made these sort of big like warehouse spaces where they're keeping something there, and she doesn't know what it is, but she knows that they're building boats. Now Rain is being taught by Commander Cherrystone to read, and so she is sort of looking at the books on Glinda's shelf. She happens upon the disguised Grimmery, and it reacts to her in a way that it doesn't to Glinda, because Rain has that kind of lineage. She is as Elphaba's granddaughter, and so she has that ability to read it, and so the Grimmery knows that, and so it sort of transforms back to its original form, and it shows her a spell that's called to call winter on water. No one really knows what that means. Rain doesn't really understand it. Glinda doesn't know what it is, but she's surprised to see that the book reacts to Rain the way it does. Glinda sort of is able to make out some of the words, and so she's kind of like muttering it to herself at one point, and she realizes that it's a spell for freezing water. And so at this point, Rain, who keeps spying on Cherrystone's army, reveals that she discovered that the big buildings that they had were housing dragons, so dragons again, and they're using the dragons as a means of like pulling the boats. So they have these huge boats, and they're going to use the dragons to pull the boats across the lake, and they're going to bring a huge invasion army to the other side of the lake where there's a strategic town. At this point, Glinda realizes that Cherrystone has been using Rain, and so when he's teaching her to read, the thing that he's teaching her to read is the pages from the Grimmery that the Emperor has, which are the ones about training dragons. And so he's been using Rain to decipher the pages on the book. So he's been teaching her to read so that she can read the magic words on this book that only she would be able to. And so Glinda realizes that things are coming to a head. She needs to get Rain out of there somehow. She also realizes that Cherrystone must know who Rain is at this point, so it's very unsafe for her to stay there. So Glinda and Rain sneak out of the hall, and when the boats and dragons begin traversing the lake, she gives Rain the Grimmery, which then transforms back to its normal self, and Rain is sort of sounding out the spell to call winter on water, and Glinda, like hearing her speak it, Glinda's able to sort of learn what it is, and so the two of them speaking together are able to chant the whole spell, and they freeze the lake, and they trap the dragons in ice, and they trap the boats so that the army can't get anywhere. So while they're trapped in the ice, Glinda goes and sets fires to the camps, or the army's camp, and destroys as much as she can, and then she gets Rain out of there because the Time Dragon Clock gang happens to be there, because the Time Dragon Clock sort of can predict the future, so they kind of knew that they would be needed, and so they show up. Glinda gives Rain to them, gives the book back to them. You know, now that she's used the magic, she can't keep it safe anymore, and so they get the book back and they get Rain, and that is the end of the section. So we don't hear from Glinda for a while, and so we learn that, you know, she's gonna stay there and do what she can, but she has to get Rain out of it. So the camera is sort of gonna follow Rain from now on. Part 2 is called The Patchwork Conscience of Oz. So Rain is now a member of the Time Dragon Clock gang, which includes Mr. Boss, who's the dwarf, Eleonora, who is Nor, which means that she is Rain's aunt, and Burr, the Cowardly Lion. And so as they're escaping, they watch from a distance as the Munchkinlanders, who see that the dragons and the army is frozen in the lake, they come and they attack the dragons. They're able to kill most of them. One escapes and flies off, but it doesn't hurt anyone. And they're able to severely kind of curtail the advance of the army. At this point, they realize that the clock of the Time Dragon is acting sort of off. Mr. Boss thought that it was because the Grimoire was away from it for so long, but the Grimoire and the Time Dragon clock are animated by different types of magic. They're sort of similar because they both come from, our world, but they don't need one another to work. And so now that he's returned the book, he thought maybe it would help a little bit, but it doesn't. And so he suspects that maybe the arrival of Rain is sort of affecting the Time Dragon clock somehow. But he doesn't really know what's going on, but the clock isn't working the way it normally does. At this point, Burr sort of suspects that Rain is the son of Lear. He's able to kind of piece some things together and make some connections. And so he kind of figures out who she is. And this is where we, the audience, are meant to sort of be like, oh, but like there's tons of hints before this. So it's kind of an open secret that Rain is the granddaughter of Elphaba at this point. But Burr is kind of the one who puts things together and realizes it. So they get the book out because they know that Rain can read it, and they try to use the Grimoire to fix the clock because they're trying to figure out what's going on with it. All the book shows is sort of a figure hidden inside a glass globe who tells them to travel south. And so they don't know what to do, but they think they do need to get out of Munchkin Land. So they travel south. Mr. Boss collects his wife, who is a Mont that we met in previous books named Sister Apothecary. She was one of the two Monts who was investigating the people who had their faces scraped off in Son of a Witch. So she's since left the Montery and she married Mr. Boss, and they're kind of living together. They call her Little Daffy. That was sort of what she was called as a child. She doesn't have any other name, so that's the name that she adopts. But she's a Munchkinlander, and so they need to get out of there because they don't want to get caught by the Emerald City army. Now, at this point, they meet sort of a bird woman who gives them some information. They update her, and the Time Dragon clock sort of comes to life briefly and shows a little snippet, which implies that Ozma, who everyone kind of assumes is dead, she's the one who was a child when the wizard arrived, and the wizard killed the regent who was in charge while she grew up. And it sort of implied that the little girl Ozma was handed off to a cloaked figure. So they don't know who that is, but there's a suggestion that maybe the child Ozma wasn't killed. Ozma is sort of the rightful heir to the throne of Oz, basically. They also learn from this bird woman that the Emperor has forbidden all magic and magical items. He's required that everything magical be turned into the Emerald City, and no one is allowed to practice magic. So at this point, the Time Dragon Clock group, they see a group of Emerald City soldiers approaching them, and they're not, because they're hauling the Time Dragon clock with them, they're not really making a lot of time. And so Rain is able to sort of connect with the clock and encourages it to kind of try to fly. And so it uses its wings and it's able to speed them along, and they're able to escape down the Yellow Brick Road. So they make it to Quadling Country, and the Yellow Brick Road sort of goes to sort of a big city there, and then it doesn't kind of go anywhere else. So they aren't really sure where to go from here. So they end up in the city of Quoyre. I don't know how to pronounce it. It's Qhoyre, and I think it's Quoyre. But anyways, they blend in with the folks there. The Quadlings think Rain is Quadling herself, which makes sense because her mother would be Candle, who is Lear's wife, and Candle is Quadling. So she has Quadling features. And so they kind of react positively to her. So they use Rain as sort of the figurehead of the group, so, people will be nice to them. So they're able to hide the clock in the city and kind of stay out of harm's way. The people there don't know about the clock, so there's no chance of it sort of getting back to the Emerald City. While there, Rain befriends a small rice otter who comes up to them. Rice otters are green because they have algae in their skin, which is kind of fun because she was born green herself but doesn't know it. She names the rice otter Tay, and it sort of stays with her. Even there's some other like rice otters that follow them, but Tay is the one who kind of connects with Rain. She also comes into possession of a pink conch shell, like a pink ocean shell, which she carries with her as like a talisman. It's sort of the first thing that she's ever owned, and it's really important to her. You know how little kids are when they get something that they think is important, and they're like, I must protect this with my life because it's important. So they stay in the city for about a year during the monsoon season, which is very wet, difficult to travel, and then they head north from here, passing through a vast stretch of poppy fields. Now the poppy fields sort of have an effect on them. They're able to sort of rush through, but it's hard going because the poppies obviously make them feel a little sluggish. While making their way, they discovered that they're being chased by invisible spiders. Now they heard about these invisible spiders in Koir, but they didn't really think that was real, and so they aren't sure if they're employed by the emperor or what the deal with these spiders are, but they can see them kind of moving through the poppies, and realize that they've been following them for a while. Now the rice otters who have been going with them fight off the spiders. They can't see the spider, but they can tell that they're fighting something, and they chase the spiders off, and they realize that they're safe. They're a little shaken because they didn't realize that, you know, the emperor's kind of minions were following them and had gotten that close. But the rice otters chased them off. Most of the rice otters return to Quadling country, but Tay, of course, stays with Rain because he loves her. As they're leaving the poppy fields, they meet Burr's old flame from the Spice Leopards that we met in book 3. Her name is Mulama Hakim. She's now kind of a leader of her people. She's a matron. She gets them caught up on current events. So they've been out of touch for a year. So she tells them that the Munchkinlanders have lost Restwater. So the lake they were fighting for, the army eventually captured it. But the civil war is continuing because the Emerald City is sort of running low on provisions, and Emperor Shell really needs the farmland of Munchkinland. So he needs more of Munchkinland. She also tells them that Shell has declared himself divine. He's set up as kind of a god emperor now at this point. And she also says that in response to the sort of encroaching Emerald City army, the Munchkinlanders have appointed sort of a witch named Mombi, who is not in charge, but she's sort of bolstering the leadership of Munchkinland. So she's kind of like an advisor to the leader. At this point, Mulama reveals that the reason she found them is because she was told to get them because Iskaneri, the goose who belonged to Lear, was flying overhead and saw them in the poppy fields and realized they needed help. And so he went and sent Mulama to get them. And so Mulama reveals that she was sent by Lear and Candle, Rain's parents. And so the troop of the Time Dragon comes back to where Lear and his wife are hiding, and Iskaneri is there as well, and Rain is reunited with her parents. So now we're in part 3, the Chancel of the Ladyfish. So Rain and Lear are reunited finally, though Rain doesn't really have much memory of her parents. She doesn't remember them. She doesn't really respond in recognition to them in any way, and it's kind of a tough thing because, you know, they've missed her for so long because they were trying to keep her safe, but she doesn't really have any memory of that. Lear is also shocked at this point to be finally reunited with Nor, who he was looking for years. She hasn't been seeking him out. She kind of wanted to do her own thing. Nor is very traumatized by all the things that happened to her when she was younger, and so she is sort of a little frosty. She's not unkind to Lear, but she very much wants to kind of keep some distance from him. We also, I don't know if this is mentioned earlier, but Burr and Nor are sort of together at this point. I think at the end of the last book, there was kind of a suggestion that was going to happen. So through the events so far, we've kind of seen that they're together. He calls her, or he thinks of her as his wife, but they're not close. She's sort of not able to have any kind of like physical relationship, so it's very much kind of an emotional partnership kind of thing, but they are very close. So Lear and Candle are living in an abandoned ruin of like a pilgrim's retreat, sort of a chapel, and the ornamentation on this chapel is based around the ocean. Now the ocean is something that's sort of seen as a myth, by all the people in Oz, because Oz is surrounded on all sides by an impassable desert, and there's no way to reach sort of the ocean. So the ocean is sort of this fantasy thing. And if you remember in the first book, Elphaba drinks the miracle elixir that the wizard had, and it gives her a vision of the sea. And that is sort of so disturbing for her that it sort of breaks her mind and sends her careening towards insanity at the end of her life, because the concept of an ocean is so terrifying and foreign to them, that much water, and especially to Elphaba, who was allergic to water. But in this sort of chapel, Rain, she has her seashell, which makes it seem like she sort of fits in this place. She puts the seashell on the shelf and it fits in with all the other stuff. She also finds a little carving of a seahorse, but no one understands what a seahorse is, so everyone thinks it's just sort of a fantasy creature that someone made up. But Rain really feels this kinship with the sea, because she has that connection through her grandmother. They talk to Iskenary at this point. Iskanary's the goose who was flying overhead and saw them in the poppy fields. He is sort of known as Lear's familiar, but Iskenary is very independent and sort of does his own thing. At this point, Mr. Boss gives the grimoire to Lear, and explaining that it's sort of his job is done. He was sent to Oz by Merlin to keep watch of the book and to use the time dragon clock to protect it and sort of keep track of things. But since the clock is broken down, he feels his term of service is near an end and there's not much else to do. He's going to keep protecting the clock in case it comes back to life, but he's sort of passing on the responsibility of guarding the grimoire by passing it on to Lear. Lear and Rain have a cute moment where they sort of talk about the book. He tells her that he's his father, but she doesn't believe him. Candle is sort of really hurt at this point because she wants to connect with Rain, but Rain is sort of independent and wants to keep herself separate from everyone. She's been very much traumatized by losing her family at a young age, and so she finds it hard to connect with people and form relationships, and so she doesn't really become warm with her family at all. At this point, Lear notices that the grimoire reacts to Rain the way it does to him, and so he wants to hide it. He wants to keep the book kind of away from her because he knows that it's going to bring her nothing but trouble, because he's sort of scared of the power in the grimoire. Lear and Burr talk at this point, and Lear reveals sort of a bit of backstory. He reveals that Rain was born green, but as they were fleeing, they met sort of a snake, like a magical snake on the road, and this snake had the ability to change skin color, and so they made a deal with the snake and was able to disguise Rain as an ordinary person to hide her green skin. Now, around this time, maybe even a little bit before that, but there is kind of it is before this. It's right before they go into the poppy fields. That's right. There's sort of an earthquake, and the time dragon clock opens up once more, and it shows them a vision of sort of destruction and rubble following an earthquake. And so this earthquake, they don't really know what it is. They think it's just because the time dragon clock is breaking down. They don't think much of it, but they go on. But at this point, there's a clock, like the time dragon clock. Now, the clock has always said 1 minute to midnight for the past many years, but Burr notices that it now reads exactly at midnight. So it's finally changed somehow. And they didn't think it could change because they thought it was just painted on. But the time dragon clock face has changed, so there's something important that's happened. And so a wren arrives and tells them that Dorothy Gale, of all people, has returned to Oz, and they realize that her return must have coincided with the earthquake that they felt. So they thought that it was just a mistake of the time dragon clock, but it was an actual earthquake. Dorothy Gale always seems to arrive with some kind of natural disaster. The first time was a tornado, and now it's an earthquake. The wren tells them that Dorothy is being put on trial for the death of Nesseros years earlier because her house landed on her. Mr. Boss doesn't really believe that Dorothy's back, but they do want to sort of go and help if they can, because they realize that she's probably being put on trial to direct people's anger towards a scapegoat, because before they were very happy that she had arrived and they weren't upset. But now that Munchkinland is being invaded by the Emerald City, there's a lot of strife and discord, and having sort of an enemy that you can direct all your anger to and sort of put on a show trial basically is something that they're doing obviously to make people feel better. And so they realize that Dorothy's not going to get a fair trial, and so they need to help her. They set off with the Grimmery, and Rain finds Elphaba's broom that was sort of stuck in the ground at one point, and it's been fully revitalized by this point. In the first book it was burned, and then in the second book it sort of came back to life when Lear started using it, and so now it's fully back to what it was before, and Rain takes it with her. Along the way they're attacked by some warthogs, and they're able to sort of drive them off and fight them off, but in the process they sort of lose their grip on the Time Dragon clock, and it rolls down a hill and ends up sinking into the poisonous lake of Kelswater, where it's sort of lost forever. So there's this, it's unclear at this point if the Time Dragon clock, sort of realizing that its time was at an end, sort of manufactured its own demise, or if they did something wrong along the way that sort of caused a chain of events which led to the Time Dragon's clock's destruction. We don't know. It's sort of implied. You can kind of come up with your own theories, but I think my theory is that the clock sort of, it realizes that its time is over, and it just sort of engineers its own destruction, because the purpose of the clock was to protect the Grimmery, and since the Grimmery was handed off to Lear, there's really nothing else for the Time Dragon clock to do. There's nothing else to sort of predict the future about, and so it sort of realizes that its time is done, and so the Time Dragon clock is no more. And so at this point the Fellowship decides to part ways. Mr. Boss and Little Daffy, they decide to retire to Munchkinland. He doesn't want to have anything else to do with anything, and now that the Time Dragon clock is destroyed and the Grimmery has been passed on, he has nothing more to do, so his time is at an end. He's just going to kind of live out the rest of his days in peace. Lear, Candle, Rain, and Nor, they go away from Munchkinland. Lear and Candle want to take Rain away to keep her hidden because she's still very important. The leadership of Munchkinland, which Emperor Shell sort of claims, it's like a matrilineal line called the Eminent Throp, and it was Nesseros for a while, but since she was dead, it should have gone to Lear because he was the son of Elphaba, who was kind of the next in line, but he didn't want to be involved in that, and so Shell is sort of using his claim on Munchkinland to justify his invasion of it, but Rain is actually the next in line because either Lear or Rain, and they get precedent over Shell. So they want to stay away from Munchkinland because they're very dangerous political enemies of the Emperor, and they don't want Rain to get hurt. So they decide to go. Nor decides to go with them because she feels like it's important that she help protect Rain. And so Burr decides he's the one that's going to go and try to advocate for Dorothy because she's going to get caught up in this show trial and he doesn't want her to die. He doesn't really have much in the way of regard for her, but he thinks that she is innocent and he wants to protect her. He wants to do something. Him and Nor sort of part ways, but they make it very clear that they're not leaving each other forever. Nor feels like she has something to do and she wants to go with Rain, and he feels like he really can help Dorothy. So they part ways, and he goes to find where Dorothy is being held. And that is the end of part 3. And that's also kind of a good halfway point to the book. So I like, ending this with sort of the destruction of the Time Dragon clock and the breaking of the fellowship, so to speak, of the Time Dragon clock group. So I will continue. There is so much plot in this one. This is a book that is very plot heavy, and it's funny going through the plot this way. It makes it feel like it's just zooming along, but I will say that part 2 drags on sort of forever because there's lots of traveling and and thinking about things, and not a lot actually happens. The first part can be a little slow as well, but I really love Glinda and Cherrystone's repartee. She's so funny because she's just like completely useless. She doesn't know how to do anything for herself, but she has a quick wit. And so she's very kind of sarcastic and is always sort of making fun of everybody. I don't know. I really like Glinda in this book. We do get to meet her again. So, you know, this isn't the end for Glinda, but that first chapter, it's so great that we had a chapter that really focuses on her. We did see her when she first arrived in Shiz in the first book. There's sort of a chapter that's from her point of view, but I like seeing her as sort of this elder statesman who's sort of just done with everybody. She's sort of annoyed at everything, and she just is sort of a little selfish, but also she still got it. She's still kind of an intelligent negotiator, but mostly she just sort of is frustrated with the state of everything. So we will see Glinda again next week. Maybe the week after, depending on when I get to it. We're going to do part 2 of Out of Oz, and then there are 3 more books, Another Day trilogy, which follows Rain, and I really do like those as well. And then there's also another book. It's a prequel that focuses on Elphaba's childhood called Elfie. I don't know if it's out yet, but it may be coming soon. So I don't know if I'll get to that anytime soon because there's a lot of other videos that I want to make, but you know, this is proceeding apace. So with that said, I will let you go. I will see you next week, and in the meantime, happy reading. Bye.